October 25, 1944, 0300 hours. The waters off Samar Island ripple beneath a blanket of tropical darkness, so complete it seems to swallow the very stars. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita stands on the bridge of the mighty battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the steel railing as salt spray mists across his face. The air carries the metallic taste of impending storm, though no clouds mar the obsidian sky above. Around him, the largest naval armada Japan has ever assembled cuts through the Philippine Sea. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Their hulls painted ghost gray to blend with the pre-dawn gloom. The admiral breathes deeply, filling his lungs with the humid air that speaks of tropical islands and distant home. In the engine rooms below, 3,000 sailors tend to machinery that represents the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering. The Yamato herself displaces 72,000 tons when fully loaded, her 18-inch guns capable of hurling shells the weight of small automobiles across 25 miles of ocean. This is Center Force, the spearhead of Operation Shogo, Japan's desperate gambit to destroy the American invasion fleet, now pouring men and materiel onto the beaches of Leyte. But there is something else moving through these waters tonight, something invisible yet omnipresent. High above the Japanese fleet, radio waves pulse outward from American ships beyond the horizon, electromagnetic fingers that probe and measure and report with mechanical precision. The Americans call it radar, though to Kurita and his officers, it remains largely a curiosity, a technological novelty that their own scientists have dismissed as unreliable, their own naval doctrine has deemed unnecessary. In the communications room of the heavy cruiser Otago, Lieutenant Commander Yoshio Suzuki adjusts his headphones and peers at the primitive radar display his ship carries, one of the few Japanese vessels so equipped. The screen shows nothing but scattered green phosphorescence, electronic snow that tells him little about the world beyond his steel cocoon. He shakes his head and returns to his voice radio, the reliable technology that has served the Imperial Navy well since the days when Admiral Togo crossed the T at Tsushima. Why trust in ghostly electronic whispers when the human eye and seasoned judgment have conquered half the Pacific? The irony of this moment will echo through history. For while Kurita's fleet advances in what its commanders believe to be perfect secrecy, every movement, every course change, every acceleration is being tracked, plotted, and transmitted to American commanders who can see the Japanese ships more clearly than Kurita can see his own formation. The electromagnetic web that surrounds Center Force grows tighter with each passing hour, guided by technology that Japanese naval tradition has taught its officers to dismiss as the fevered dream of Western scientists who have forgotten the ancient art of seamanship. The first pale suggestions of dawn begin to paint the eastern horizon. Admiral Kurita orders his fleet to increase speed. Soon, he believes, they will fall upon the American transports like wolves among sheep, their massive guns crushing the invasion force that dares to threaten Japanese soil. The plan is elegant in its simplicity, born of a naval culture that has glorified the decisive battle since the time of the samurai. But the Americans are not sheep, and the wolves are about to discover that their prey has been watching them all along. The story of how radar came to dominate the naval warfare of World War II begins not in the laboratories of Massachusetts Institute of Technology or the research stations of Britain, but in the fundamental transformation of how nations viewed the ocean itself. For centuries, the sea had been humanity's great unknown, a vast wilderness where ships appeared and disappeared like phantoms, where the ability to see first meant the difference between victory and annihilation. Naval battles were contests of seamanship, courage, and the trained eye, qualities that the Imperial Japanese Navy had cultivated to a degree that bordered on the mystical. By 1944, Japan's naval officers had been raised on stories of Tsushima Strait, where Admiral Heihachiro Togo had positioned his fleet with such precision that the Russian Baltic fleet sailed directly into his guns. They had studied under commanders who could read wind and weather like ancient texts, who could estimate distance and bearing with an accuracy that seemed supernatural to lesser sailors. This was Bushido applied to the sea, the way of the warrior refined through decades of tradition and practice. The concept of radar, radio detection, and ranging challenged this entire worldview. How could electromagnetic waves bouncing off metal hulls be superior to the trained eye of a lookout who had spent years learning to distinguish between a cloud and a smoke plume at 30 miles? How could mechanical calculations surpass the intuitive understanding of wind, tide, and current that separated true sailors from mere technicians? To many Japanese officers, radar represented not progress, but a retreat from the essential human qualities that made naval warfare an art rather than a science. This philosophical resistance was reinforced by Japan's early experiences with radar technology. In 1941, Japanese scientists had successfully developed their own radar systems, but these early models were plagued by technical difficulties and limited range. The equipment was bulky, unreliable, and required constant maintenance by specialists who were in short supply throughout the Pacific Fleet. More damaging still, the early Japanese radar sets were easily detected by enemy receivers, broadcasting the position of Japanese ships to any Allied vessel equipped with the proper listening equipment. Captain Minoru Genda, one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack, had experimented with radar during the planning stages of that operation. His conclusions were less than encouraging. The radar eye sees poorly in rain and grows blind in heavy weather, he reported to the Naval General Staff. It cannot distinguish between enemy ships and fishing boats, between mountains and clouds. A seasoned lookout remains superior in all conditions that matter to victory. This assessment was not entirely unfair. Early radar technology did suffer from significant limitations. The systems were prone to interference from weather, required considerable electrical power, and often provided ambiguous readings that demanded interpretation by trained operators. But while Japanese naval culture emphasized these weaknesses, American and British scientists were working systematically to address them. The difference lay not in technical capability, but in institutional attitude toward technological innovation. The Americans approached radar not as a replacement for human skills, but as an enhancement of them. Where Japanese officers saw radar as a crutch that would weaken their sailors' natural abilities, American commanders viewed it as a force multiplier that would allow smaller numbers of ships to fight more effectively. This fundamental difference in perspective would prove decisive as the war progressed and technology advanced. By 1943, American radar had evolved far beyond the primitive systems that had disappointed Captain Genda. The new Mark 8 fire control radar could track multiple targets simultaneously, calculate firing solutions automatically, and guide naval gunfire with unprecedented accuracy. More importantly, American naval training had evolved to integrate radar operators fully into the combat decision-making process. Rather than treating radar as a separate system operated by specialists, American ships used radar information to create a comprehensive picture of the tactical situation that was shared among all officers. The Japanese response to these advances was telling. Rather than investing heavily in radar development and training, the Imperial Navy doubled down on traditional methods. Night fighting techniques were refined to an extraordinary degree. Lookouts were trained to use specialized low-light optics that could spot ships at remarkable distances. Navigation became so precise that Japanese commanders could position their fleets with clockwork accuracy even in complete darkness. These skills were real and formidable. At the Battle of Savo Island in August 1942, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa's cruiser force achieved complete surprise against an Allied fleet that included radar-equipped ships, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and damaging others in a night action that lasted barely 30 minutes. The victory seemed to confirm traditional Japanese naval doctrine, that seamanship, training, and fighting spirit could overcome any technological advantage. But Savo Island was an exception, not the rule. As American radar technology improved and became more widespread throughout the fleet, Japanese reliance on traditional methods became an increasingly critical disadvantage. The electromagnetic spectrum that Japanese officers dismissed as unreliable was becoming a new ocean, one in which American ships moved with growing confidence, while Japanese vessels remained effectively blind. The transformation was most evident in the realm of night fighting, where Japanese forces had previously held a decisive advantage. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, American destroyers and cruisers began engaging Japanese ships at ranges that made visual detection impossible, using radar to guide their gunfire with lethal precision. The battles around Guadalcanal told the story in stark mathematical terms. Japanese night fighting victories became increasingly rare, while American successes multiplied. Yet even as evidence mounted that radar was reshaping naval warfare, many Japanese officers remained skeptical. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, one of Japan's most successful destroyer commanders, captured this attitude in his post-war memoirs. "We had learned to read the sea as our ancestors read the mountain forests. Every ripple spoke of wind direction. Every color change revealed depth and current. How could a machine that saw only in straight lines understand the curved world of the ocean?" This resistance was not mere stubborn traditionalism. Japanese naval culture had been shaped by centuries of island warfare, where intimate knowledge of local conditions, tides, currents, seasonal weather patterns, provided decisive advantages. Radar seemed to promise a kind of warfare divorced from these natural factors, one in which technological superiority could overcome local knowledge and fighting spirit. For officers raised on the principle that victory belonged to those who best understood their environment, this represented not just a change in tactics, but a challenge to their fundamental identity as sailors. The institutional momentum behind this resistance was enormous. The Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima had produced generations of officers trained in traditional methods. The entire promotion system rewarded those who excelled at navigation, seamanship, and the traditional martial virtues. Adopting radar warfare would have required not just new equipment, but a complete restructuring of naval education and culture. A transformation that few institutions can manage during wartime. Meanwhile, the Americans were building an entirely new kind of navy. The Essex-class aircraft carriers that began joining the Pacific Fleet in 1943 were equipped with radar systems that could track aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The new Iowa-class battleships carried fire control radar that could engage targets beyond the visual horizon. Most importantly, the American fleet was developing new tactical doctrines that integrated radar information at every level of command. The Combat Information Center, or CIC, became the nerve center of American naval operations. In these darkened rooms, illuminated only by the green glow of radar screens, officers could track dozens of contacts simultaneously, coordinate airstrikes, and direct surface actions with a level of tactical awareness that had never before been possible. The CIC represented more than technological advancement. It embodied a new philosophy of naval warfare based on information dominance rather than individual heroics. Admiral William Bull Halsey captured this transformation in a letter to his wife written aboard his flagship in late 1943. "We fight differently now than we did 2 years ago. The old battleship admirals who relied on guts and seamanship are giving way to younger men who understand that information is ammunition. A commander who can see his enemy's movements while remaining invisible himself holds an advantage that no amount of courage can overcome." This philosophical divide between American and Japanese approaches to naval warfare would reach its climax in the battles of 1944, as Japan's increasingly desperate strategic situation forced its fleet into confrontations where traditional tactics would prove inadequate against technologically superior opponents. The stage was being set for a collision between two naval cultures, one rooted in centuries of martial tradition, the other embracing the possibilities of electronic warfare. The human cost of this technological gap was already becoming apparent in smaller engagements throughout the Pacific. Japanese destroyers, once the terror of Allied convoys, were being hunted and destroyed by American ships that could track them from ranges that made return fire impossible. Japanese submarine operations, traditionally conducted by commanders with an almost supernatural ability to position their boats for surprise attacks, were failing as American escorts used radar to detect periscopes and snorkels long before visual contact. The Japanese response to these defeats revealed the depth of their institutional blindness to radar's potential. Rather than acknowledging technological inferiority, many commanders attributed their losses to bad luck, superior enemy numbers, or the declining quality of Japanese personnel as the war dragged on. The possibility that American radar might represent a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare remained, largely unexamined within official circles. This denial was reinforced by the occasional success of traditional Japanese tactics. When conditions favored visual detection, in clear weather with good visibility, Japanese forces could still achieve remarkable results. The night battle off Cape Esperance in October 1942 had shown that American radar was not infallible, and that aggressive Japanese commanders could still win through superior seamanship and night fighting techniques. But these victories were becoming increasingly rare, and the strategic situation was forcing Japan into battles where technological superiority mattered more than tactical skill. The American advance through the Central Pacific was supported by carrier task forces that used radar to coordinate air operations on a scale that dwarfed anything Japan could manage. The invasion of the Marshall Islands, the assault on Truk, the bloody fighting for Saipan, each operation demonstrated American ability to mass and coordinate forces with precision that traditional Japanese methods could not match. By October 1944, as Admiral Kurita prepared to lead center force into what would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy faced a crisis that went far beyond simple technological inferiority. The entire conceptual framework that had guided Japanese naval strategy since the Meiji Restoration was proving inadequate to the demands of modern warfare. Yet the institutional momentum of tradition, combined with the desperate strategic situation facing Japan, made it impossible to abandon the tactics and techniques that had served the Navy well for nearly half a century. The irony was that Japan possessed the industrial capacity and scientific expertise to develop effective radar systems. Japanese electronics companies had pioneered many of the technologies that would later be incorporated into advanced radar sets. Japanese physicists understood the theoretical principles involved as well as their American counterparts. What Japan lacked was not capability but institutional will, the recognition that naval warfare had fundamentally changed and that adaptation was essential for survival. This failure of adaptation was not unique to the Japanese Navy. Throughout history, military institutions have struggled to incorporate revolutionary technologies that challenge established doctrines and hierarchies. The difference in World War II was the speed at which technological change was occurring and the unforgiving nature of naval combat, where a single engagement could determine the fate of entire fleets. As dawn approached on October 25, 1944, these historical forces were converging toward a confrontation that would demonstrate, with brutal clarity, the consequences of technological blindness. Admiral Kurita's center force was approaching what its commanders believed would be a glorious victory, the destruction of the American invasion fleet and the salvation of the Philippines. Instead, they were sailing into an engagement that would expose the fundamental inadequacy of traditional naval tactics against an enemy that could see them coming from beyond the horizon. The green glow of American radar screens had already detected center force hours before any Japanese lookout would catch sight of American ships. In combat information centers throughout the Pacific Fleet, young American sailors were tracking the Japanese advance with mechanical precision, plotting intercept courses and calculating firing solutions while their opponents relied on dead reckoning and the naked eye. The electromagnetic web that surrounded Kurita's fleet was invisible to Japanese sensors, but it was as real and constraining as steel cables. Every course change, every formation adjustment, every increase in speed was being monitored and reported. The Japanese ships were like actors on a stage, unaware that their every movement was being observed by an audience that would soon become their judges and executioners. In the flag plot of the battleship New Jersey, Admiral William Halsey studied the radar reports streaming in from his scout planes and surface vessels. The Japanese fleet was approaching exactly as American intelligence had predicted, following a course that would bring them into range of American guns at the worst possible time for the enemy. Halsey allowed himself a grim smile as he contemplated the irony. The Japanese commanders who had perfected the art of naval surprise at Pearl Harbor were about to learn what it felt like to be the victims of perfect situational awareness. The battle that was about to unfold would be fought not just between ships and men, but between two different conceptions of what naval warfare could become. On one side stood the accumulated wisdom of centuries of seamanship, the intuitive understanding of wind and weather that had made Japanese officers masters of the Pacific. On the other side was a new kind of warfare based on electronic intelligence, mathematical precision, and the systematic application of technology to the ancient art of war. The outcome of this confrontation had been determined months earlier, not by the courage of individual sailors or the quality of their ships, but by the institutional decisions that had shaped how each navy approached the challenge of fighting in the electronic age. The Japanese had chosen to trust in tradition and human skill. The Americans had embraced technology as a force multiplier that could overcome numerical disadvantage and geographical obstacles. As the first light of dawn began to illuminate the waters off Samar, both fleets were moving toward a rendezvous that would demonstrate which philosophy of naval warfare was better suited to the realities of the 20th century. The green glow of radar screens had already provided the answer, but the human cost of that lesson was yet to be paid. The men aboard Kurita's ships went about their duties with the confidence born of decades of training and tradition. In gunny, turrets, and engine rooms, on bridges and in communications centers, Japanese sailors prepared for a battle they expected to win through superior fighting spirit and tactical skill. They could not know that their enemies were watching their every move, calculating the precise moment to spring a trap that had been months in the making. The electromagnetic spectrum that Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as unreliable was about to become the decisive factor in the largest naval battle in human history. The officers who had scoffed at radar as a curiosity unsuited to real warfare were about to discover that their enemy had transformed curiosity into a weapon more devastating than the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was about to begin, and with it would come the final, brutal education of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the realities of electronic warfare. The lesson would be written in fire and blood across the waters of the Philippine Sea, a testament to the price of institutional blindness in an age when information had become the ultimate weapon of war. The fundamental difference between Japanese and American approaches to radar technology crystallized in the pre-dawn hours of October 25, 1944, as two vastly different naval philosophies prepared to collide. Aboard the Japanese ships of Center Force, the Night Watch maintained vigilance through methods perfected over decades of traditional seamanship. Lookouts positioned at key points throughout each vessel swept the horizon with powerful binoculars, their eyes trained to distinguish between the subtle gradations of darkness that might reveal an enemy mast or the telltale glow of a ship's wake. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamamoto, standing watch on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Haguro, embodied this tradition perfectly. The son of a fishing family from Shizuoka Prefecture, he had learned to read the sea before he could properly read written characters. His eyes could detect the difference between a distant squall and the smoke of a ship's funnel at ranges that amazed his fellow officers. Tonight, as every night, he trusted these senses more than the crude radar display that flickered intermittently. In the ship's combat information room, a space so small and poorly equipped that it seemed almost an afterthought compared to the spacious bridge where traditional navigation and combat direction took place. This reliance on human senses reflected more than simple technological conservatism. Japanese naval training had elevated seamanship to an art form that bordered on the spiritual. Young officers spent years learning to gauge distance by the apparent size of objects on the horizon, to estimate speed by the shape and color of a ship's bow wave, to predict weather changes from subtle shifts in wind direction and barometric pressure. These skills were not merely technical accomplishments, but expressions of a deeper connection between sailor and sea that formed the foundation of Japanese naval identity. The institutional culture that supported this approach was remarkably sophisticated. The Imperial Naval Academy at Itajima produced officers who could navigate by celestial observation with precision that rivaled mechanical instruments, who could estimate the range and bearing of enemy ships through techniques passed down from generation to generation of naval warriors. Combat exercises regularly tested officers' ability to fight effectively in conditions where electronic systems had failed or been destroyed, ensuring that traditional skills remained sharp even as technology advanced. But this emphasis on traditional methods had an unintended consequence. It created institutional resistance to technologies that seemed to threaten the very skills that defined professional competence. Radar operators were often relegated to secondary status within ship organizations. Their reports filtered through layers of traditional command structure that valued human judgment over mechanical calculation. The radar rooms themselves were frequently located in less protected parts of the ship, reflecting their perceived secondary importance to overall combat effectiveness. Contrast this with the scene aboard the American destroyer USS Johnston, where the Combat Information Center had become the nerve center of the ship's fighting capability. Lieutenant Robert Hagen, the ship's radar officer, sat before a scope that showed every surface contact within 30 miles, their positions updated automatically every few seconds with precision that no human lookout could match. But more importantly, Hagen was not isolated from the ship's command structure. His reports went directly to the captain and tactical action officer, forming the basis for immediate tactical decisions. The Johnston's CIC represented a revolution in naval organization as much as technology. Here, information from multiple radar sets, radio intercepts, and communication networks was integrated into a comprehensive picture of the tactical situation. Young petty officers trained in electronics and data analysis worked alongside experienced seamen to create a level of situational awareness that would have seemed magical to naval commanders of previous generations. This integration reflected a fundamental difference in how American naval culture viewed the relationship between technology and human skill. Rather than seeing radar as a threat to traditional seamanship, American training emphasized how electronic systems could enhance human capabilities. Radar operators were trained not just to read their scopes, but to understand the tactical implications of what they saw. Communications specialists learned to correlate radio intelligence with radar contacts to build detailed pictures of enemy movements and intentions. The institutional changes required to support this approach were enormous. American naval training schools had been completely reorganized to incorporate radar operations, electronic warfare, and data analysis into the basic curriculum for all officers. The Navy had established new rating systems to recognize expertise in electronic warfare, creating career paths that attracted talented personnel to what had previously been considered secondary specialties. More importantly, American naval doctrine had evolved to take advantage of radar's unique capabilities. Night fighting techniques were developed that allowed ships to engage targets they could not see, using radar-directed gunfire to achieve surprise at ranges where return fire was impossible. Anti-aircraft operations were revolutionized by radar. Systems that could track multiple incoming aircraft and direct defensive fire with mechanical precision. The contrast between these approaches was starkly evident in how each Navy handled the challenge of coordinating multiple ships in complex tactical situations. Japanese naval doctrine relied heavily on predetermined battle plans executed through flag signals, searchlight communications, and radio messages that followed carefully rehearsed procedures. This system worked well when conditions matched expectations, but it became increasingly unwieldy as tactical situations grew more complex and fluid. American fleet operations, by contrast, were based on continuous information sharing between ships equipped with compatible radar and communication systems. A destroyer on the screen could detect and report enemy contacts to the entire task force, allowing commanders to adjust their formations and tactics in real time based on actual conditions rather than predetermined plans. This flexibility proved crucial as the war progressed and tactical situations became increasingly unpredictable. The human dimension of this technological divide was profound. Japanese sailors took pride in their ability to function effectively without mechanical assistance, viewing radar dependence as a sign of weakness that would ultimately prove fatal in combat. Stories circulated throughout the fleet of battles, won through superior seamanship and fighting spirit, reinforcing the belief that human qualities remained decisive in naval warfare. American sailors, meanwhile, were learning to see technology as a partner rather than a crutch. Radar operators developed an almost intuitive understanding of their equipment, able to distinguish between genuine contacts and false returns, to track multiple targets simultaneously, and to extract tactical intelligence from electronic signatures that revealed enemy ship types and formations. These skills were different from traditional seamanship, but no less demanding or valuable. The psychological impact of these different approaches was beginning to show. By 1944, Japanese naval officers increasingly reported feeling blind and helpless when facing American forces that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of Japanese movements and intentions. The traditional advantages of superior night fighting, techniques, and intimate knowledge of local waters were being neutralized by an enemy that could see through darkness and weather with electronic eyes. Conversely, American naval officers were developing a confidence that bordered on hubris as they discovered the extent of their technological advantages. Admiral Raymond Spruance captured this mood in a letter to his wife written after the Battle of the Philippine Sea. "We can see them before they see us, track them when they cannot track us, and engage them at ranges where they cannot effectively return fire. It is not that our sailors are braver or more skilled than theirs. We simply fight from a position of such overwhelming informational superiority that the outcome is rarely in doubt." This confidence was not misplaced. By late 1944, American radar technology had achieved capabilities that seemed almost science-fictional to observers accustomed to traditional naval warfare. The new Mark 22 radar could simultaneously track over 40 separate targets, calculate firing solutions for multiple engagements, and coordinate the movements of entire task forces with precision measured in yards rather than miles. Surface search radar could detect ship masts at ranges exceeding the visual horizon, while air search systems provided early warning that allowed fighter aircraft to intercept incoming raids before they reached their targets. Perhaps most importantly, American industry was producing these advanced systems in quantities that allowed them to be installed throughout the fleet. While Japanese ships might carry one or two primitive radar sets, that required constant maintenance and provided ambiguous information, American vessels were equipped with multiple specialized systems that provided redundant coverage and unprecedented reliability. The logistical implications of this technological superiority were staggering. American fleet operations could be planned and executed with mathematical precision because commanders had accurate, real-time information about the position and movement of their own forces. Supply operations, previously dependent on visual identification and time-consuming communication procedures, could be coordinated through radar contact and electronic navigation aids. Even basic seamanship became more efficient when ships could maintain precise formation intervals regardless of visibility conditions. Japanese naval operations, by contrast, remained dependent on the vagaries of weather, visibility, and human perception. Fleet movements had to be planned around the limitations of visual communication and traditional navigation methods. Combat effectiveness degraded rapidly in poor weather or darkness, when the human senses that Japanese doctrine relied upon became less reliable. These differences were compounding as the war progressed, and tactical situations became more complex. The American ability to coordinate large-scale operations across hundreds of miles of ocean gave them decisive advantages in the island-hopping campaigns that were bringing Allied forces ever closer to Japan itself. Japanese forces, increasingly isolated and unable to concentrate effectively against American landing operations, found themselves fighting a series of desperate defensive actions rather than the decisive battles that their doctrine had envisioned. The psychological toll of this technological inferiority was evident in the increasingly desperate measures adopted by Japanese commanders. The kamikaze attacks that began in earnest during the Philippines campaign reflected not just strategic desperation, but a recognition that traditional naval tactics had become inadequate against technologically superior opponents. If Japanese ships could not engage American forces on equal terms, perhaps suicide attacks could overcome the advantages provided by radar and electronic warfare. But even these desperate measures were hampered by the same technological limitations that plagued conventional operations. Kamikaze aircraft, dependent on visual navigation and human piloting skills, were vulnerable to radar-directed anti-aircraft fire that could track and engage them at ranges where traditional defensive methods were useless. The very qualities that made Japanese pilots formidable in individual combat. Their reliance on intuition, aggression, and personal skill became liabilities when facing systematic electronic defenses. As dawn approached on October 25, 1944, these technological and cultural differences were about to be tested in the crucible of naval combat. Admiral Kurita's center force represented the pinnacle of traditional Japanese naval power. Massive ships crewed by experienced sailors and commanded by officers whose understanding of seamanship and naval warfare had been refined through decades of training and combat experience. But they were approaching an engagement against an enemy that could see them coming from beyond the horizon, track their every movement, and coordinate defensive measures with precision that traditional methods could not match. The green glow of radar screens aboard American ships had already detected center force, hours before any visual contact would be possible. In combat information centers throughout the 7th Fleet, young American sailors were plotting intercept courses, calculating firing solutions, and coordinating airstrikes against an enemy that remained unaware of their observation. The electromagnetic spectrum that Japanese naval doctrine had dismissed as unreliable had become a weapon more powerful than the largest guns ever. Mounted on a warship, the stage was set for a confrontation that would demonstrate with brutal clarity the consequences of institutional blindness to technological change. The officers who had scoffed at radar as unsuited to real naval warfare were about to receive an education in electronic warfare that would shatter their confidence in traditional methods and forever change the nature of combat at sea. The morning mist that clung to the waters off Samar Island on October 25, 1944, seemed to whisper of the technological revolution about to unfold. As Admiral Kurita's center force pushed northward through the pre-dawn darkness, their massive ships cutting through seas that reflected no light, the Japanese commander felt the familiar confidence that came from commanding the most powerful surface fleet his nation had ever assembled. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi represented the ultimate expression of naval architecture. Floating fortresses whose 18-inch guns could hurl projectiles weighing as much as small automobiles across distances that stretched beyond the visual horizon. Yet even as Kurita admired the sleek lines of his heavy cruisers and the purposeful efficiency of his destroyer screen, invisible fingers of electromagnetic energy were already probing his formation, measuring distances, calculating speeds, and reporting positions to an enemy that remained unseen beyond the curve of the Earth. The Americans had transformed the very air around the Japanese fleet into a weapon, filling it with radio waves that revealed every movement, every course change, every tactical adjustment with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The irony was profound. Japanese naval officers had spent decades perfecting their ability to fight in conditions where visibility was limited or non-existent. Night battle tactics had been refined to an art form, with commanders learning to position their ships through dead reckoning and celestial navigation, to estimate enemy positions through sound and smell as much as sight. These skills were real and formidable. At Savo Island, Japanese cruisers had achieved complete tactical surprise against radar-equipped American ships, sinking 4 heavy cruisers in a night action that lasted barely 30 minutes. But the Americans had learned from Savo Island and similar defeats. Rather than simply installing radar equipment on their ships, they had fundamentally reimagined how naval battles should be fought. The Combat Information Center had become more than just a room filled with electronic equipment. It was the nerve center of a new kind of warfare based on information dominance rather than individual heroics or traditional seamanship. Lieutenant Commander Harold S. Hamlin, radar officer aboard the escort carrier USS White Plains, represented this transformation perfectly. A former mathematics teacher from Iowa, Hamlin had been trained not just to operate radar equipment, but to think systematically about how electronic information could be converted into tactical advantage. His scope could track multiple surface contacts simultaneously, but more importantly, he understood how to correlate radar returns with radio intercepts, visual sightings, and intelligence reports to build a comprehensive picture of enemy movements and intentions. This integration of information sources was what Japanese naval doctrine had failed to grasp. While individual Japanese ships might carry radar equipment, they lacked the institutional framework to convert electronic intelligence into coordinated tactical action. Radar operators were often isolated from command decision-making, their reports filtered through traditional command hierarchies that valued human judgment over mechanical calculation. The consequences of this institutional blindness were about to become tragically apparent. As Kurita's fleet approached what their commander believed would be a surprise attack on defenseless transport vessels, every ship in his formation had been tracked, identified, and reported to American commanders who were already positioning their forces for maximum tactical advantage. The Japanese ships were like actors on a stage, unaware that their every movement was being observed and analyzed by an audience that would soon become their executioners. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Captain Ernest E. Evans studied the radar plot that showed the approaching Japanese formation with crystalline clarity. The enemy ships appeared as green blips on his screen, their positions updated every few seconds with accuracy that no human lookout could match. But Evans was not content simply to observe. He was already calculating attack angles, estimating speeds, and coordinating with other American ships to create a coordinated defense that would maximize the technological advantages his forces possessed. This was the new reality of naval warfare that Japanese commanders had failed to comprehend. Combat was no longer a contest between individual ships or small formations fighting within visual range of each other. Modern naval battles were complex, multidimensional engagements where information was as important as firepower, where the ability to see and coordinate was often more decisive than raw courage or superior seamanship. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a new ocean, one in which American ships moved with growing confidence while Japanese vessels remained effectively blind. Radio waves carrying radar returns, voice communications, and electronic intelligence were weaving a web of awareness around Kurita's fleet that made traditional concepts of surprise and concealment obsolete. The technical specifications of American radar systems by late 1944 represented a quantum leap beyond anything available to Japanese forces. The Mark 8 fire control radar installed on American battleships and cruisers could track multiple targets simultaneously while calculating firing solutions with mechanical precision. Surface search radar could detect ship masts at ranges exceeding 30 miles, while air search systems provided early warning that allowed defensive fighters to intercept incoming raids before they reached their targets. More importantly, these systems were integrated into comprehensive combat management networks that allowed individual ships to share information instantly across entire task forces. A destroyer on radar picket duty could detect enemy aircraft or ships and immediately transmit that information to every vessel in the formation, creating a level of situational awareness that had never before been possible in naval warfare. Japanese radar technology, by contrast, remained primitive and poorly integrated into fleet operations. The few Japanese ships equipped with radar carried systems that were unreliable, short-ranged, and operated by personnel who had received minimal training in their use. More damaging still, Japanese naval doctrine provided no framework for converting radar intelligence into coordinated tactical action. Radar operators remained isolated specialists, whose reports were often ignored in favor of visual observations and traditional navigation methods. This technological gap was compounded by fundamental differences in industrial capacity and research priorities. American electronics companies were producing advanced radar systems in quantities that allowed them to be installed throughout the Pacific Fleet, while Japanese industry struggled to manufacture even primitive systems in numbers adequate to equip major combatants. The resource allocation decisions that had shaped each nation's approach to naval warfare were now revealing their consequences in the most direct possible way. The human dimension of this technological revolution was perhaps its most significant aspect. American naval officers were learning to see electronic systems not as replacements for traditional skills but as extensions of human capability that allowed small numbers of ships to fight more effectively against larger opponents. Radar operators developed an almost intuitive understanding of their equipment, able to distinguish between genuine contacts and atmospheric interference, to extract tactical intelligence from electronic signatures, and to coordinate complex operations through voice radio and data links. Japanese officers, meanwhile, remained bound by a naval culture that emphasized individual skill and traditional seamanship over systematic use of technology. The institutional momentum behind this approach was enormous. The entire promotion system, training curriculum, and operational doctrine of the Imperial Navy was built around principles that had served well in previous conflicts but were becoming increasingly inadequate to the demands of modern warfare. The psychological impact of this technological inferiority was already evident in Japanese naval operations. Throughout the Pacific, officers reported feeling helpless and disoriented when facing American forces that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of Japanese movements. The traditional advantages of superior night fighting, techniques, and intimate knowledge of local waters were being systematically neutralized by an enemy that could see through darkness and weather with electronic eyes. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of Battleship Division I, captured this sense of bewilderment in his diary entries. from the weeks preceding the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The enemy appears to know our every movement before we ourselves have decided upon it. Their ships coordinate with precision that suggests some form of communication beyond our understanding. We fight bravely, but we fight as blind men against opponents who see clearly. This blindness was not metaphorical, but literal. While American ships operated with radar coverage that extended beyond the visual horizon, Japanese forces remained dependent on optical observation and sound detection methods that were increasingly inadequate against technologically superior opponents. The very qualities that had made Japanese naval forces formidable in earlier conflicts, their emphasis on individual skill, aggressive tactics, and traditional seamanship, were becoming liabilities when facing systematic electronic warfare. The approaching confrontation off Samar would demonstrate these principles with mathematical precision. Admiral Kurita's center force, for all its imposing firepower and the skill of its crews, was approaching an engagement where traditional tactics would prove inadequate against enemies who could track their every movement, coordinate defensive measures with unprecedented precision, and engage at ranges where return fire was impossible. The green glow of radar screens had already sealed the fate of ships whose commanders still believed in the decisive power of big guns and fighting spirit. The electromagnetic web that surrounded center force was invisible to Japanese sensors, but it was as real and constraining as steel cables. Every tactical decision made by Japanese commanders was being observed, analyzed, and countered by American officers who possessed information that seemed almost telepathic in its comprehensiveness. As the first pale light of dawn began to illuminate the eastern horizon, two different eras of naval warfare were about to collide. On one side stood the accumulated wisdom of centuries of seamanship, the intuitive understanding of wind and weather that had made Japanese officers masters of the Pacific Ocean. On the other side was a new kind of warfare based on electronic intelligence, mathematical calculation, and the systematic application of technology to the ancient art of naval combat. The outcome of this confrontation had been determined not by the courage of individual sailors or the quality of their ships, but by institutional decisions made years earlier about how each navy would adapt to the challenges of 20th-century warfare. The Japanese had chosen to trust in tradition and human skill. The Americans had embraced technology as a force, multiplier that could overcome numerical disadvantage and geographical obstacles. The lesson that was about to be written in Fire and Blood Across the Waters Off. Samar would demonstrate with brutal clarity which philosophy of naval warfare was better suited to the realities of modern combat. The officers who had scoffed at radar as unsuited to real warfare were about to discover that their enemies had transformed electronic curiosity into a weapon more devastating than the largest guns ever mounted on a warship. The electromagnetic revolution that would define this battle had begun not in the research laboratories of universities, but in the practical necessities of convoy protection and night fighting that had characterized the early years of the Pacific. War. American naval commanders, faced with Japanese superiority in night combat techniques, had been forced to find technological solutions to tactical problems that traditional methods could not solve. The development of radar-directed gunfire control represented one of the most significant advances in naval technology since the introduction of steam power. Where previous naval battles had been fought at ranges where human vision could identify targets and estimate distances, radar-controlled weapons could engage enemies beyond the visual horizon with accuracy that seemed magical to observers accustomed to traditional gunnery methods. The Mark 8 gunfire control system installed on American heavy cruisers could track multiple targets simultaneously, while calculating complex firing solutions that took into account wind speed, ship movement, and ballistic characteristics of different ammunition types. More importantly, the system could maintain target locks even when enemy ships were completely invisible to human observers. allowing American vessels to engage Japanese forces in conditions where traditional gunnery was impossible. This capability had already proven decisive in numerous engagements throughout the Pacific Campaign. At the Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943, American destroyers had used radar-directed gunfire to sink 3 Japanese destroyers in a night action where visual identification was impossible. The Japanese ships, fighting according to traditional tactics that emphasized visual observation and close-range engagement, were unable to return effective fire against enemies they could not see. The psychological impact of these encounters on Japanese naval personnel was profound. Sailors who had trained for years to fight in conditions of limited visibility suddenly found themselves facing enemies who seemed to possess supernatural vision. The traditional advantage that Japanese forces had enjoyed in night combat, their superior training in visual detection and close-range tactics, was being systematically neutralized by electronic systems that operated with mechanical precision regardless of lighting conditions. But radar technology represented more than just improved gunnery control. The integration of radar systems into comprehensive combat information networks was creating new possibilities for fleet coordination that had never before existed in naval warfare. American task forces could maintain precise formation intervals in complete darkness, coordinate complex tactical maneuvers across hundreds of miles of ocean, and respond to threats with speed and precision that traditional command methods could not match. The Combat Information Center had become the brain of modern naval operations, a space where information from multiple sources was integrated into comprehensive tactical pictures that allowed commanders to make decisions based on complete awareness of the battle space. Young officers trained in electronics and data analysis worked alongside experienced seamen to create a level of situational awareness that previous generations of naval commanders could never have imagined. Admiral Chester Nimitz captured the significance of this transformation in a memorandum to the Chief of Naval Operations written in September 1944. We are no longer fighting the same war that began at Pearl Harbor. The introduction of advanced radar systems and their integration into fleet operations has fundamentally altered the nature of naval combat. Our ships now fight as components of an integrated system rather than as individual units, and our tactical capabilities have increased exponentially as a result. This systematic approach to naval warfare stood in stark contrast to the Japanese emphasis on individual ship performance and traditional fighting methods. While American forces were learning to function as elements of a larger electronic network, Japanese ships continued to operate according to principles that emphasized self-reliance, individual skill, and the martial virtues that had served the Imperial Navy well in previous conflicts. Institutional barriers to adopting radar technology within the Japanese Navy reflected deeper cultural values that prized human qualities over mechanical assistance. The concept of Bushido as applied to naval warfare emphasized personal courage, intuitive understanding of tactical situations, and the ability to function effectively under extreme conditions without relying on technological aids. Radar systems, with their dependence on electronic components and specialized operators, seem to violate these fundamental principles. Moreover, the Japanese naval education system had been designed to produce officers who excelled at traditional seamanship and combat techniques. The Imperial Naval Academy at Etajima emphasized navigation by celestial observation, estimation of distances and bearings through visual methods, and the development of what was termed sea sense, an intuitive understanding of maritime conditions that could only be acquired through years of experience. This educational philosophy produced naval officers of exceptional competence within their chosen specialization, but it also created institutional resistance to technologies that seemed to threaten the very skills that defined professional excellence. Radar operators were often viewed as technicians rather than true naval officers, their contributions valued less highly than those of officers who had mastered traditional maritime arts. The consequences of this cultural resistance were becoming increasingly apparent as the war progressed and American technological advantages multiplied. Japanese naval operations were growing more difficult to coordinate as American radar coverage